Shalom, my name is Adam Wasser from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York. When talking about Mashiach, the Messiah, the Messianic year, I first like to look at what is the Messiah and what is the Messianic year. Rambam, Maimonides, a holy rabbi from the Middle Ages, a doctor, a philosopher, a man of making laws in Judaism, said that when the Mashiach comes, when Messiah comes, first there will be a war that the Jews will fight against the world. This war will bring about the rebuilding of the temple and the Jewish people's coming back to the land of Israel. He says that when the war comes, whoever is this king of the Jewish people, leader, they will say, maybe he is the Messiah. Then when they win the war, they will say, maybe he is the Messiah. Then they will go and say that the temple is being rebuilt. Maybe he is the Messiah. And then they will say, when the Jewish people return, maybe he is the Messiah. But it will not be until the Jewish people, the resurrection of the dead will take place, that it will be confirmed that he is the Messiah. Ultimately, we learn that the resurrection of the dead and the beginning of this is when the Messianic era actually begins. It is not the war, it is not the rebuilding of the temple, but the actual coming to life of the dead. Now we can argue, what does that mean that the dead will re-arise? Does that mean that people will stop dying and always live? Does that mean that physically the people will come out of the ground as they were before they died and go to Israel? This is unclear. But what is clear is that the Messianic era begins. The time of Mashiach begins when the resurrection of the dead begins. Now, what is a king of Israel? What does this mean? Well, for one, he is an observant Jew, somebody who holds by the 613 laws of Judaism, somebody who is of the line of King David. Now, in Judaism, most Jews will say that in every generation there is a Mashiach. There is somebody who has the potential to be the king. And it's ultimately up to the Jewish people to make that happen, that they need to be ready and do certain things, doing mitzvahs, Torah, learning Torah, giving charity, loving one another, not committing adultery, and so forth, that makes this king come to life in the fact that he can be the Moshaich, that he can lead a people who are ready to be led. But he must be somebody who is alive. He must be somebody who is real. In certain groups of Chabad, they will say that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, said that we don't need a war for Mashiach to come, that Mashiach can just come through doing Torah and mitzvahs, good deeds and learning of the Bible, and that by doing this we can ultimately bring the dead, the resurrection of the dead, immediately. And people will say, certain groups will say, that by the dead being re-arisen, that the Rebbe will be alive immediately and he will be the king Mashiach. Others will say, no, this is a process like the Rambam. It takes 40 years or so forth to make this happen. So it has to be a living person, literally, who is alive to lead us into this redemption. There are people like Maimonides who will say that after the resurrection of the dead, people will still die, and that even the king, the Mashiach, will be somebody who will die, and his son will take over, and it will be a period of time. In the Talmud, in the Gemara, it states that there will be a time, 1,000 years, of the Messianic era, that there will be 1,000 years of Mashiach, and then the world will be destroyed, and then reborn again. Now, what does this mean? It means that when Mashiach comes, we will uplift ourselves to a higher level, a higher being of purpose, of having a deeper connection towards God and ourselves, and that we will be ultimately good and wholehearted, peace and love towards one another. And this is the idea of Mashiach. It's not an idea that you live in a palace and you lived a good life with 1,000 slaves, that you better yourself and you bring yourself closer to God, so that the world will be destroyed, and the idea that the world as we know it today will not exist, because the purpose of this world is to bring ourselves to a higher level. But by this 1,000 years, we will already be on a higher level, so the world will be destroyed in a way so it can take in more of that power of being greater in holiness and goodness. It also says in the Gemara, the Talmud, that after 2,000 years after the 1,000 years, the world will be re-destroyed again. And this is not the idea that it will physically be destroyed, but it will be destroyed in the fact that we know it as a place that we can uplift ourselves, and God can come down into this world in a spiritual way of more godliness into the world, and that the world needs to be destroyed in the idea that it needs to be readjusted in order for more godly light to be into this world. So this is, in many ways, the idea of Mashiach, the messianic year, to bring godliness more into this world and more goodness and peace into this world. So we're talking about 3,000 years history into what the messianic year is all about. The Talmud goes on and talks about how eventually the world will be completely destroyed because there won't be any purpose, and that we'll all go to heaven, Shemayim, to live there, because the physical world has a purpose of us uplifting ourselves and bettering ourselves, and there will come a point where that we have achieved that ultimate goal. Now, when talking about Jesus, now people will say Jesus is not Yeshua. I will say that Jesus and Yeshua are the same people. Now, there are certain Jews that will say that Yeshua is somebody from the Gemara that was a wicked person. Christians will say that Yeshua was somebody from the New Testament. Whatever the case is, I'm talking about the Yeshua of the New Testament. I don't have a problem with the New Testament as far as Yeshua is concerned. What I do have a problem with is the idea that the teachings, the New Testament was written by Jews. It was put together by Jews. Everybody, most of the characters in the New Testament are Jewish, including Jesus, Yeshua, whatever. When they brought their words into being and they put them into paper, they talked in a Jewish way, in a mystical, Kabbalic way. So when they say Yeshua is the Son of God, now this in Judaism is common. We know this. We say, we are all the children of God, the children of Israel, the children of God. And this is not to say that we are literally God. We are God in the flesh. This is a misunderstanding. We are not God in the flesh. We are a part of God. Just like my father, I am a part of my father. I'm a part of my mother. I am my own individual, but I am a part of them. I came from them. It's the same thing by saying that I am the Son of God. I am the Son of God. I'm a part of God, but I am not God himself. This is a big misconception. Another part that is a misunderstanding is that the idea that God came down in the flesh, and this is a big thrift between Judaism, Christianity, and even Messianic Jews and Jews for Jesus, Jews for Yeshua, in the idea that if God came down in the flesh, then who was he praying to in the garden? He was praying to God. Who did he say his father was? Himself? Who was he praying to? Himself? That's not how we look at it, because the things that Jesus talked about and taught were the same exact things that are found in Judaism. But when they were taken, Peter and Paul, for example, when they started converting the Jews of Turkey, of Asia Minor, they started converting them to Christianity. Well, the Jewish church in Jerusalem, with John as their leader, went and said, you have to be a Jew and then you can be a Christian. You believe in Jesus, but you have to be a Jew first. Peter and Paul went and said, no, you can be a Christian and later a Jew. You don't have to keep kosher. You don't have to keep ritual purity. You don't have to be circumcised. You can be a Christian. John and the church in Jerusalem separate themselves from Paul and Peter and said, no, that's not how it works. That's not what Jesus was all about. So these people who were pagans before in Asia Minor, they took their pagan beliefs and their pagan ideas and introduced it into this new form of Christianity, which became Christianity. And they took Jewish beliefs and Jewish ideas and put it and intertwined it with pagan ideas. And this idea that God, that Jesus, Yeshua was the flesh of God, was misunderstood. It's not that it wasn't true, because this is what we learn in Judaism, but understanding it is totally the opposite of what it's meant to understand. Now, we can go and say, well, why can't Yeshua be the Messiah? Listen, I'm a bit different from my brothers and sisters in the Jewish world. I don't have a problem with the idea of Yeshua being the Messiah, Mashiach. But the Messiah, Mashiach, must be a living person. He must be somebody who is physically alive and ready to lead the Jewish people into the future. So in every generation there is a Mashiach. Maybe he was the Mashiach of that time. I don't know. But in every line, maybe Bar Kokhba, who led a revolt in the hundreds of in 145, I believe it was, in Israel against the Romans. Maybe he was Mashiach. Rabbi Akiva says he was. Maybe the Rebbe was Mashiach. Maybe Maimonides, Rambam was Mashiach. Maybe because Maimonides came from the house of David. I don't know. It's very possible. I'm not against it. But ultimately, you have a king, and then you have another king, and you have a line of kings that come along the way. And to say that King David, for example, if anybody should be the Messiah, the Mashiach, should be King David. He was the father of this line. But we look at and say that when Mashiach comes, the ultimate of the resurrection of the dead, and that King David and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses will come to life once again. David will take a back seat. He will not be the king. He will be on the sidelines, learning Torah, whatever, and maybe have his own yeshiva, but he won't be in charge like that. And that's, a lot of times we take things from the Numbers, the books of the prophets, and we like to twist and chain them into what we wish to believe and put into being. But ultimately, we all can have our own interpretations and all beliefs in how these things should be interpreted. But for mainstream Judaism, people that have practiced Judaism and learned their whole entire lives and focused on these things, realize that you can't say that I'm a Jew for Yeshua, or I'm a Messianic Jew in that sense, of taking Yeshua and equaling him to God, because you're forming a religion based on a man. Judaism is not about basing a religion around a man. We don't say, God bless me through Moses, God bless me through Abraham, God bless me through Rachel or Rebecca. We don't say these things. God bless me. Kadosh Baruch Hu, Elohim. That's how we bless ourselves. Now another little thing I like to bring up is the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. I say this once, Yahweh. We don't use this name because it's so sacred and so holy. It's such a higher being of what we... in Judaism, we look at that a person should humble themselves, a person should lower themselves in a proper and happy way, but we don't look at ourselves as so high and mighty that we can use a name like that. So we don't use the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei in its literal format, because it's disrespectful to God. But ultimately, when we pray to God, when we look at God and uplift ourselves, yes, we can use Abraham or Isaac or whoever to get inspiration, but we're not praying to them. We're praying to God, and we find ultimately our overwhelming existence belongs to God. Another point, does it really matter who the Messiah is? Bringing Mashiach is about bringing unity and love and happiness and godliness into this world, with or without a king. The king is like the leader of the physical idea. By focusing on who the Messiah is holding on to that materialism of this is the king, and the godliness goes away. How can we say that we're ready for the Messianic era when we're so focused and so overwhelmed by the physical materialism of a king? We have God. God says we need this king, that he will lead us. But that king is not going to come about unless we are ready, unless we are willing to do the steps and do the things that are right to make the time happen. So the idea of a king is more in a mental, psychological state of I need God as a figurehead in a physical format. Don't forget when Moses came from Mount Sinai, they came down with the tablets, the luchos, and he found a golden calf. And many will say that golden calf was a representation of Moses, because the people lost Moses. They didn't know how to worship God without Moses, so they made a golden calf as a representation of Moses. Because a lot of people need a physical essence to pray to God. Like the temple itself is does God need a temple? No, he doesn't need a temple. We need that temple because we need something physical to hold on to God. And in many ways, Mashiach, the King, is that mental, physical part that we need, that connection. But ultimately, as time continues, that is not going to be the case. And I encourage everyone, read more and understand more about the details of what Mashiach is and the Messianic year. God bless.